Hello. In this video, I'm going to be talking about fascism. So last unit rather, we talked about World War One, and there are a lot of historians who will call the 19th century the long 19th century because it really kind of ended with World War One. So lots of things changed with World War One, and a lot of that was had to do with nationalism, which we talked about quite a bit, right? Um, but when you think about, so World War One was about nationalism, and nationalism didn't go away with the war. But the war itself was devastating. It was costly in terms of money, but also in terms of lives lost. And then when you think about how the Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh penalties on Germany. It returned Alsace and Lorraine, the territories that those two countries have been fighting over since shortly after the death of Charlemagne, right? When his grandsons, divided the territory up into three, and that was in the middle, and then so they've been fighting over it for a long time. It gave it back to France, the treaty did, and it basically imposed war guilt on Germany and an indemnity for everything. So they had to pay a huge amount of reparations, and in addition to the responsibility for starting the war, even though Germans didn't agree. World War One, if we look back on it, really accomplished very little. Perhaps it just made them worse. There are historians who will say that really there was one world war with 20 years of peace in the middle, and that's how closely connected they really are. But one of the really important things that happened at the end of World War One was the rise of fascism. And fascism is a conservative movement, but it's concerned with the glorification of the state. It talks about a glorified, imagined nation. If some of you have read Benedict Arnold's Imagined Communities, that's kind of building on that, right? And so fascism is building on this, the glory of the state, the rejection of these liberal ideas and liberal individualism. We need to be, the state's more important than the rest of us, right? And along with that is a very powerful leader, almost to the point that people use the term cult, right? And so these fascist movements started to pop up at after the end of the war. The first place was in Italy, okay, and that's the term fascism comes from a Roman term, and their kind of little logo that they had, okay, um, but so that was the first one, and then of course we're all kind of familiar with Nazis as well. Okay, so but to get back to kind of the ideas behind fascism, and they're all a little different, which is why I kind of jumped ahead. But especially we see with the Nazis this kind of pseudoscience and race. Okay, so the it's almost like we put the nation and our ethnic identity. I'm a German, I'm an Austrian, I'm a Frenchman, right above everything else, almost to the point of a race, right? And certainly we saw that the Nazis made Judaism, Hebrewism as a race. More than in contrast to the Aryan race, right? And that's really that it's anti-Semitism is based on the Semitic language of of the of the um, of the Jewish people. It's not a race. It's anyway. But fascism is also a cultural movement. So all of these things are kind of all working together for that. Okay. Um, the other big movement that we had in this time was communism. And a lot of people kind of confuse these. So, how are they similar? How are they different? Okay, so both fascism and communism rejected the bourgeoisie, the middle class, the democracy, that kind of democratic movements. They wanted absolute control, but they're very different economic systems. So communism is based on this idea that everything is shared equally, and the reality, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit more, but the reality is that the only way to do that they could figure out was to have the state own everything. But the fascist leaders, the communist leaders, they were dictators. They were absolute, reigns. That authoritarian reigns, I guess, is the better word. Authoritarian leaders. So they have common enemies in the capitalists and the regimes that support the common people and democracy and stuff like that. So, as I said, Italy was the first place, and we're all familiar with Mussolini. So he became, he and some other army veterans kind of put the Italian Fascist Party together. They didn't like the way Italy was treated after the war, and there was a lot of social turmoil in Italy right after the war. They were afraid of the strength of the Italian Communist Party, and so they were fighting back against them. The fascists had this paramilitary unit of people that they called the black shirts, and they kind of went around and tried to whip everybody in line, especially fighting the communists. Okay. And so the King of Italy, Emmanuel III, appointed Mussolini as prime minister. He wanted his help in against communism, but I've also, read in other places that he thought he could control Mussolini, but he couldn't. And the same thing kind of happened in Germany as well. These guys were populists. That's another kind of characteristic of fascism, is that the leaders are populist, that they're supported by the common people. Okay, so Mussolini set about destroying whatever democracy there was, and then pretty soon he had control. He was il duce, right? He was in total control over everything. And one of the aspects of this is that it controls every part of the life of Italians, right? So the women were supposed to stay home and have babies that would become good citizens and good fascists, etc. So and there's this corporatism that your book talks about, this kind of everybody works together. So everybody is kind of not in the communist sense, but they're all working to support the fascist government, even in times of freedom, I mean of peace. Okay. So in Germany then, after the war, a republic was set up. It was the Weimar Republic, and it's called that because that's where the Constitution was written, in the city of Weimar. And it was, yay, this is liberalism at its best. We're going to have this, this democratic government, but it was largely ineffective. The president, and he probably wasn't even a big fan of it anyway. But so he was it was not public. It was not popular. Sorry, it was public. It was not popular. But one important thing that the fascist government, which were called the Nazis, we're kind of going over the beginnings of them, but there was this idea of a stab in the back, right? Germany didn't really lose the war. They were cheated out of it. They were cheated out of their victory. They were on the way to victory. They were cheated out of it by people who were not loyal to Germany. mostly Jews and communists, right? So the Versailles Treaty, as I said, it kind of allowed that to, you know, propagate or grow, I guess. It also required Germany to disarm, which is, here again, we're getting robbed of our ability to have an army. And so it was the Reichstag was the name of their legislature, and it was pretty much ineffective, didn't get much done at all, right? There were, like, I think your book said 32 different political parties. Nobody was working together. It was chaos. Okay. So out of economic issues, I forgot to mention those. So economic issues, they had these payments that they couldn't really make. They couldn't meet the payments for the war. So they started printing, currency until you guys that do economics. If you print enough currency, you're going to have really bad inflation, and that's what happened. Okay, they did ask to negotiate the payments. France didn't like that. They went into the Ruhr Valley, which was where all of their manufacturing and mining was, to get their money that way. So that's when they started, printing currency, which resulted in hyperinflation, right? So out of all of this then grows the Nazi Party. And Hitler was at the center of that. He didn't really create the Nazi Party. He joined the Nazi Party, but then he made it grow significantly, right? So he was, prior to the war, he was born in Austria. He spent some time in Vienna, and it's considered usually that when he was in Vienna is when he, became, indoctrinated in his anti-Semitic views. And so, and he was largely not very successful. He tried to be an artist, etc. He joined World War I, kind of like, yes, this is what we need to do. And, he was very enthusiastic about it, right? So he thought that Austria and Germany should be one because they share a culture. Back to that nationalism, right? And if you've taken the first half of this class, you know that when they were actually, and it was in this class, wasn't it? It was in this course, right? When they were considering the unification of Germany and who to include, they didn't include Austria. But not everybody agreed with that. So anyway, so after the war, he was sent to Munich. And that's where he kind of hooked up with the German Workers' Party, which ended up being renamed a really long, well, in English, just National Socialist German Workers' Party. And my German is really bad, so I'm not even going to try it, but Nazi for sure, right? And so they were slightly different than the fascists in Italy because of this whole biological stuff, the Aryan race, and so the Aryan race is who's going to be taking over, and so there's this hierarchy. So there's the Aryan race, and that includes the Swedes and the Danes and people like that, but then there's some other people that are kind of next on they're still okay, they're smart, they contribute, they have a culture like the Persians or the Japanese, and then at the bottom are the bad people, right? The bad races, the Serbs, the Romani, otherwise known as the Gypsies, the Slavs, the Poles, and the Jews, of course. So those people were at the bottom. Now that didn't happen in Italian fascism, but anyway. So he blamed Jews for everything that went wrong. So he set up, he's building his party. He sets up the stormtroopers. He tries to overthrow the government in an act called the Beer Hall Putsch. It failed, got a very light sentence. was in prison for, I don't know, something like 6 months, is when he wrote Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, in which he really laid out his plan and why he blamed the Jews for everything. And if you've not read it, you can find it in English. And um, I've read it. It's not very pleasant, but it's kind of enlightening in a way, right? And so, he became a national celebrity. He grew to power. In the middle of all this is the depression, of course. So things are not going well. But one of the things that he was kind of banking on is, well, the Nazi Party started to win some elections. Not overwhelmingly, at least not the ones that were not rigged, but he ran for president, lost to Hindenburg. But then Hindenburg, who was the president, was convinced to use Hitler and the Nazis to help him dismantle the Weimar state and replace it with a more authoritarian political order. Again, he thought he could control him. He put him in, the second most powerful position in state, and he went from there. So Hitler took over the government very quickly, and he got a measure approved where all civil rights were suspended. That allowed them to get rid of the Communist Party, but it also enabled them. So they passed what's called an Enabling Act, which empowered Hitler and the presidential cabinet to pass laws. So then they really started passing laws, right? So then they started with all of the laws that were restricting the civil rights of the Jews. This is when he started all of his propaganda, and started really pushing this. The Nazi Party controlled Germany from 1933 until the end of the war in 1945. Okay. It was called the Third Reich, and it was, a continuation of it was going to be 1,000-year term. And it was, the first one was the Holy Roman Empire. The second one was, I don't remember. Anyway, this is the third. So anyway, Rome, and then the Holy Roman Empire, and then I think. So anyway, so this is kind of how he got started. Suspension of civil rights, absolute control, that sort of thing. So if we're talking about fascism, we should probably also take a look at what was happening in Spain. So Spain was having a lot of political upheaval. For a while, there was a republic, but people didn't like the republic and like what was happening. So then they ended up in a civil war. They established a fascist government under Francisco Franco, and they got help from Italy and Germany, especially. In Germany, they got to try out all of their war weapons and stuff. Now, the Soviets did provide some help to the communist rebels. A lot of people just went on their own to fight in this war. But by the time it was over, Franco was in charge, and he was in charge until he died. And they stayed out of World War II. And there's a lot more details about that, but I've been talking long enough. So I think, kind of what this is all about is kind of the rise of fascism in the period following the First World War, and we'll go from there.